First of all, thank you very much to the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the Hoover Institution for inviting me to moderate this wonderful panel and for sponsoring all of the events this week as we commemorate the centennial of the Bolshevik Revolution. In the spirit of some comments from this morning, especially those of Professor Kors, I wanted to give you a quotation from an unjustly neglected, I think, Sovietologist named Valdemar Gurian. He once wrote, "A living lie is superior as force to a dead truth." It's a rather melancholy reflection, but I think it expresses something true about human life, and it suggests the importance of the work that the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation does. I'm honored to serve as a moderator for this afternoon's discussion, and before I introduce our speakers, let me just say a few words, I'll be very brief, by way of introducing the particular theme for this panel. Defined strictly, a totalitarian regime is one that bans all political and social activity that is not expressly approved by the state. Such regimes aspire to total control of its population. It seeks to create a totally unified society. It does not permit any autonomous activity by societal or civic organizations. All such organizations are either banned or co-opted by the Communist Party. Totalitarian regimes gain their legitimacy by claiming to be unerring actors in fulfilling historical laws. They claim, in a sense, to be more lawful and even more rightly ordered than any regimes in human history. Once in power, such parties must demonstrate that their rule is justified. Thus, they must display for their citizens that the socialism that was once promised is being realized. Because reality proves recalcitrant, a vast and complex system emerged to engage people in a demonstration of socialism's presence and power. Only the pseudo-reality or the ideological lie is allowed public recognition. All public human interactions are infused by the dictates of ideology. Václav Havel argued that this is what gives totalitarian regimes their distinctive brand of repression. They force people to become pillars of the system which oppresses them. People must constantly conform their speech and actions to fit the demands of the party. This can mean publicly affirming the guilt of someone whom you know to be innocent, attending a May Day parade, or in Havel's paradigmatic example, placing a placard in your shop window that reads, "Workers of the world, unite." Thus, an elaborate network of appearances, rituals, and patterns of speech are developed to legitimate the fiction of a flourishing socialist regime. This is what the great philosopher-historian Alan Besançon identified as the moral destruction of communism. Now, the consistency and the pervasiveness of the mendacity can be appalling, but only if one's faculties don't become numbed and one is able to see the fictions for what they really are. This is how captive minds were fashioned and how civil society was crushed. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once wrote, quote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist." Today we will hear about how some particularly courageous people sought to resist such systems, and how and why they decided, in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's wonderful phrase, to live not by lies. Now let me introduce each of our speakers and we'll proceed with the panel. Each of our guests will speak for about 10 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer from our audience at the end. To my right, the far end of the stage, the Honorable Natan Sharansky. Natan Sharansky was born in Donetsk, Ukraine. He was arrested on trumped-up charges of treason and espionage, convicted in a Soviet court, and served 9 years in the Gulag. Following massive public campaigns by the State of Israel, the World Jewry, and other leaders of the free world, Mr. Sharansky was released in 1986. He was a spokesman for the human rights movement, a prisoner of conscience, and a leader in the struggle for the right of Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel. Mr. Sharansky was a founding member of the Helsinki Group, which monitored violations of international agreements of different religions and national groups in the Soviet Union. He worked closely with Andrei Sakharov, the renowned Soviet human rights activist, and kept a close contact with foreign media beyond the Iron Curtain. In Israel, he established the Yisrael Be'aliyah Party and served in 4 successive Israeli governments as minister and deputy prime minister. In 2009, Natan Sharansky was appointed chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel. Mr. Sharansky is also the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the author of 3 books, Fear No Evil, The Case for Democracy, and Defending Identity. And of course, he'll be honored tomorrow evening with the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom. To Mr. Sharansky's left, Mr. Joshua Rubenstein. He is an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. He's been involved with human rights and international affairs for over 40 years, both as an activist and an independent scholar. He is an expert on human rights in the former Soviet Union and the Holocaust in German-occupied Soviet territory. His writings have been published in Commentary, The Nation, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and the New York Review of Books, among many other publications. His books include The Last Days of Stalin, Leon Trotsky, A Revolutionary's Life, Stalin's Secret Pogrom, The Post-War Inquisition of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, Tangled Loyalties, The Life and Times of Ilya Ehrenberg, and Soviet Dissidents, Their Struggle for Human Rights. To his left is Ambassador Martin Palouš, who is a senior fellow at Florida International University's School of International and Public Affairs and the director of its Václav Havel Center for Human Rights and Diplomacy. One of the first signatories of Charter 77, he also served as a spokesman for this dissident human rights group. He was a founding member of the Civic Forum, which emerged from the Charter in November of 1989. And then he was elected to the Czechoslovakian Federal Assembly in 1990 and became a member of its Foreign Affairs Committee. He has served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, as Ambassador of the Czech Republic to the United States, and then as Ambassador of the Czech Republic to the United Nations. Mr. Palouš has degrees from Charles University in Prague and Masaryk University in Brno. He has also held a number of teaching positions at Charles University. He's lectured extensively in the United States and served as a visiting professor at Northwestern University and as associate professor at Central European University in Budapest. Finally, Ambassador Paula Dobryninski is a foreign policy expert and former diplomat specializing in national security affairs. She's a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy Project at Harvard's Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and has also served as the Distinguished National Security Chair at the United States Naval Academy. During her more than 25 years in national security affairs, Ambassador Dobriansky has held many Senate-confirmed and senior-level positions in the United States government. From 2001 to 2009, Ambassador Dobriansky served as Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. In February 2007, as the President's Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, Ambassador Dobriansky received the Secretary of State's highest honor, the Distinguished Service Medal, for her contribution to the historic devolution of power in Belfast. And relevant for our panel today, She was Director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council, the White House, for the Reagan administration from 1980 to 1987. She has received many other high-level international recognition, including the Commander Cross of the Order of Merit of Poland, the Grand Cross of Commander of the Order of the Lithuanian Grand Duke Gediminas, the National Order Star of Romania, Hungary's Commander's Cross Order of Merit, and Ukraine's Order of Merit. She has a BSFS summa cum laude in international politics from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a PhD in Soviet political military affairs from Harvard University. So that's our panel, and I will now turn it over to Natan Sharansky.
Thank you. First of all, I apologize for my voice. I got cold, so I'll try to make my best that you'll understand me. Second, I'll tell you frankly, in the program it was written that I'm the last speaker, so I thought while the others will be speaking, I'll decide what I have to comment. But because I'm the first, I have to choose. And it's such a huge topic, Soviet Union and communist ideology, and how we were coping with this, and how we were fighting against it. It's such a huge topic.
Sure.
So I'll take one episode. How we decided to start Helsinki movement. And I think it will say a lot about the dynamics which was developing between Soviet Union, the free world, and dissidents. For many, it seems that somehow Soviet Union, at the moment of weakness, signed such a great international agreement, Helsinki, and then Soviet Union had no choice but to follow it. Of course, the reality was very different. The dissidents in the Soviet Union, at the moment of signing of Helsinki Agreement, a publication of it, Helsinki Final Act, did not see it as a victory. To the contrary, they saw it as one more proof of the betrayal by the free world of their human rights cause. Why? Because look, so there is first basket about the borders. For the first time, the free world recognizes the occupation of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, what happened with Eastern Europe, recognizes that that's yours, that belongs to Soviet Union, we are not going to challenge it anymore. The second basket is economical cooperation. Who is interested in economical cooperation? Soviet Union, as we dissidents understand, is so weak from inside. It fully depends on the cooperation, in fact, assistance of the free world. And then there is the third basket about human rights. And that will be lip service. The Soviet Union until now succeeded. Each time when the West speaks about human rights, Soviet Union says, you have your understanding of human rights, and we have our. You're speaking about freedom of speech, and we're speaking about freedom not to be hungry. We make sure that nobody is hungry. Everybody is employed. Your so-called freedom is freedom to die from hunger under the bridge, or something like that. There was such a phrase. So, and as we saw, again and again, the West was, not that the West believed in it. Thanks God we lived already, I'm speaking now about 60s and 70s, when we hoped at least that practically nobody believes in this awful dream which brought so many people killed, the dream about the world of equal, without nations, without religion, without property, where everybody is equal, and this Soviet paradise. So even they don't believe in the nobility of these ideas, but they see Soviet Union as a bully, as an extremely powerful country which has nuclear weapons, and we should better find a way to cooperate with it. And in fact, all the initiatives on human rights finished with the fact that that was a lip service, but practically Soviet Union was getting what it wanted. So the first reaction was exactly this. And then we had discussions, especially I had long discussions with Andrea Maleric and Yuri Orlov. Andrei Malerik is the dissident who in 1969 wrote the book Whether the Soviet Union Will Survive Until 1984. It took 84 because of Orwell, but also because of 15 years from 69. But in fact, he described how weak Soviet Union is from inside, that it spends all its energy to control the brains of the people, and it will inevitably fall apart. And that's how we felt how weak it is. But the West looked at the Soviet Union and saw how strong it is, what a great power it is. And Yuri Orlov, who also was one of the first, after Andrei Sakharov, Soviet scientists who started speaking freely his mind, and his success in science didn't stop him from speaking freely his mind and challenging the system. So I proposed, in the best experience of our Soviet Jewry movement that I was active and spokesman of it, I proposed that let's try to involve the public opinion of the West in discussing how we, representatives of public opinion, understand the third basket about human rights. Maybe we will find such a common ground that it will be so publicly discussed that there will be no way for Soviet Union to avoid it, because we believe that in another month or two, Soviet Union will take it into a very dangerous place where it will be only lip service. And then, and we start preparing such a letter appealing to the public representatives of different countries, independent representatives. Let's start kind of discussion club about how we understand what really the concept of human rights means. And then suddenly they gave permission to Amerik to leave. So we are meeting with Yuri Orlov, and they say, no, how is our letter? And he says, Natan, I decided I don't want any letters. There'll be more talk and more talk and more talk. If we really want to influence, we are going to declare that we are creating the Helsinki Watch, and we have to start publishing the documents about specific cases, what is happening in the Soviet Union. And if we'll be successful, if these documents, because of after Helsinki Agreement, will draw attention, then we'll show the real face of Soviet Union, and that will be more. Then it will be more difficult for the West to deceive themselves. And Yuri said, of course, we will be arrested. And he said, I think this time we will be arrested in high treason. But at least we will make our statement, we'll make our case. And what is all these discussion clubs? I told him, I don't think you're right. I think they will arrest us for anti-Soviet activity. So it's not death penalty, it's only 7 years. But probably you're right about this fact that it needs to create it, so let's do it. So in fact, year after this, we were all arrested. But as an irony is that I was arrested for high treason, he was arrested for anti-Soviet activity, so everybody, so they got it wrong. But during those 11 months between arrests of all of us or exile and creation of Helsinki Group, what happened? First of all, our documents got a lot of attention, and there was Ukrainian Helsinki Group created, and then Lithuanian Helsinki Group, but the documents got a lot of attention. Where? In American Congress. Mrs. Congresswoman Fenwick created its own Helsinki Group. At some moment I get from the American political attaché a word that now I don't have to pass him these documents in secret as before. He got instruction from, then it was Carter administration, to receive straight these documents from our group and to bring them to American administration. And on the other hand, what really happened, that because of Voice of America, the other radio stations, which were broadcasting not only our documents, but our names with their addresses, people started coming from all over the Soviet Union with their problems straight to our homes. Well, there was no internet, so each document was taking a lot of time to collect information and then to publish it. But we were really working day and night, and it suddenly changed the atmosphere. And we all started discussing these documents as the real face of the Soviet Union. And there were documents about Jewish immigration, documents about Pentecostals, documents about Catholics in Lithuania, and Crimea Tatars, and many other human rights causes, and very rude violation of it. So when we were arrested, it was already very difficult to avoid discussion of these issues. And in fact, all the Helsinki process, which continued then for years, was all about, not about the first basket, not about the second basket. It was all about human rights and linking the first basket and the second with the question of human rights. Now, of course, the main question which we had, whether the West will understand that Soviet Union is not such a powerful superpower, but it's very weak from inside. It was so obvious for every dissident. And then, by far, the best way of 9 years in Gulag was when President Reagan made his speech about evil empire. Of course, we didn't hear his speech, but if you are not in a punishing cell, you can read Soviet newspaper Pravda. And there was an article condemning President Reagan, how he dared to make such an awful speech. It's against all the laws, all the rules of diplomacy, all the relations, and so on. And we became hysteric. Finally, the leader of the free world calls Soviet Union by its name. And we had no doubt the moment the West will understand the real nature of Soviet Union, the moment they will understand that the desire of people to live in freedom is the non-conventional weapon which the free world has against Soviet Union, the days of the Soviet Union will be counted. 3 years ago, when I was released and first time came to Washington, and among the other things, of course, went to President Reagan to thank him for the great role which he played both in my personal fate, but also the fate of many others. And I told him how happy he made all of us for this speech. He said, come here, listen to this man. And then I understood, and then I heard also how he was under strong criticism from his close circle for making such a speech, because people felt that it's like violation of all the international norms. I think it's very important to remember that to speak the truth, it's important not only when you are dissident of the Soviet Union, but also when you're President of the United States of America. Thank you.
Natan, thank you. Just a word or two of introduction. I very much appreciate the generous introduction I was given. Let me add, I was an organizer and regional director of Amnesty International USA for 37 years, and it very much informs what I'll be speaking about today. And also to remind you of how controversial it was for President Ford to sign the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial that summer saying, "Jerry, don't go," meaning don't go to Helsinki. So there's a lot of pressure on the US government not to go along with the Helsinki Final Act, and no one could foresee what its eventual consequences would be. My talk this afternoon is entitled "The Struggle Against Fear and the Legacy of the Soviet Human Rights Movement." Just over 30 years ago, sometime in the middle of 1986, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev decided, in the words of his advisor, Anatoly Chernyayev, to turn off the lever of repression. The regime stopped arresting prisoners of conscience and began the process of releasing those it was already holding. With this step, a highlight of the long-ago era of glasnost and perestroika, The human rights movement, as we had come to know it, ceased to exist. The movement had lasted for 2 decades, emerging for the first time in 1965 in response to the arrest of 2 Soviet writers, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, who had taken the extraordinary step of sending essays and short stories to the West, where they were published under pseudonyms. It was the public nature of how their friends and supporters responded, with appeals and petitions, a nonviolent demonstration, and the circulation of an unofficial but reliable transcript of their trial that set the pattern for many events that were to follow. The dissident writer Andrei Amalrik, whom we've already heard, once commented to me in an interview that even now the regime exists, perhaps not only, but mainly, on the interest from the capital of fear amassed under Stalin. The achievements of the human rights movement can best be understood against this background of enforced silence. In 1968, following a series of political trials, 3 dissidents, Ilya Gabay, Yuli Kim, and Pyotr Yakir, wrote a letter to Soviet cultural and scientific figures warning against the rebirth of Stalinism. This was, of course, under Brezhnev. They understood that the regime relied, quoting, on our own passivity, our short memory, and the bitter fact that we are accustomed to an absence of freedom, unquote. Only exposure, it seemed, could restrain the authorities. Recalling the country's isolation under Stalin, when it seemed as if the West had no knowledge of his crimes, Pyotr Yakir described the movement's principal goal, quoting, "They tried to make public every illegal act committed in our country so that all the world may know. This is a great stride forward by comparison with Stalinism. Under Stalin, there was always an iron curtain, and no one knew what was going on here. Millions of people were destroyed, and nobody knew anything about it. Now we try to publicize every arrest, every dismissal from work. We consider this the main task today," unquote. The human rights movement reflected and reinforced a breakdown in the political and cultural isolation of the Soviet Union. As unsanctioned poetry circulated, then novels, and finally detailed information about political trials and conditions in the labor camps, the regime's control of information grew less effective. Through correspondence, diplomats, and tourists, the West also learned about Soviet life in greater and more vivid detail. The regime could not ignore this development. For the most part, the authorities responded with arrests and other reprisals, but the repression inflicted on the dissidents should not obscure the tangible changes they accomplished. For the first time, individuals did not have to submit through inertia to the regime's lawlessness, but could decide for themselves how to act. In his book, The Challenge of the Spirit, Boris Shragin described their predicament, quoting, "Instead of having to decide between parties and political programs, the choice is between 2 ways of life. One consists of obeying one's own conscience, with all the suffering that is bound to ensue. The other of avoiding anxiety by renouncing one's freedom," unquote. No moral dilemma existed under Stalin, because the consequences of open dissent were so certain and often so final. There was also a complete lack of information about the scale of repression. But once the regime relented after Stalin's death, we'd like to say it moved from the period of being a carnivore to the period of vegetarianism. But once the regime relented after Stalin's death, it was only natural that at least some people would test the limits of free expression, and by their example, encourage others to do the same. By the late 1960s, this makeshift collection of individual activists, liberal Marxists, Orthodox believers, Democrats, writers, scientists, would-be Jewish émigrés, could be said to constitute a movement, or perhaps parallel streams within a movement, because they shared certain fundamental beliefs and possessed sufficient moral and political solidarity. They had learned, as Shragin again commented, that, quoting, "moral and legal demands are a force in themselves that could drive the physically omnipotent but spiritually bankrupt authorities into a corner." Gorbachev's program is what finally broke down the political and cultural constraints of Soviet life. But as much as the dissidents helped to prepare the groundwork for Gorbachev's reforms, Historians are likely to debate the role the human rights movement played in provoking his initiatives altogether. Gorbachev himself has denied that the human rights movement had any discernible impact on the development of perestroika. Neither in his memoirs nor in the memoirs of his close advisors is there more than a passing reference to Andrei Sakharov or the slightest acknowledgement of the dissident's role in the post-Khrushchev period to promote liberal democratic values. When he lectured at Harvard in November 2002, Gorbachev insisted that reforms could never have emerged, quoting, from below, primarily because virtually all the dissidents were either in jail or in exile by the mid-1980s. So how could they be credited with initiating change when they never had access to levers of power in the ordinary political sense? Gorbachev and his advisors like to claim that they found their inspiration within the very communist system they were determined to reform. For them, the image of Lenin as a more tolerant political leader, in contrast to the murderous Stalin, the limited economic and cultural achievements of the new economic policy of the 20s, the political alternatives that Bukharin offered the country, and most immediately the example of Khrushchev and the 20th and 22nd Party Congresses, when Stalin was denounced openly as a tyrant, offered a legitimate political legacy and the basis for a political program that included respect for fundamental rights and historical truth, economic reform, integration into the world economy, more open borders, unfettered debate within the party itself, and an end to censorship in society at large. Nonetheless, this revolution from above should not obscure the role of the human rights movement in shaping Gorbachev's priorities. It was the dissidents who first relied on international agreements like the Helsinki Final Act to explain and advance their cause. It was the dissidents who first made human rights an international issue and added such words as gulag, glasnost, and samizdat into the world's vocabulary. Vladimir Bukovsky once insisted that Mr. Gorbachev did not invent glasnost. He borrowed it from the Soviet human rights movement. And it was their courage and sacrifice that helped to set the moral agenda for Gorbachev's reforms and the terms for his acceptance in the West. By that I mean that Gorbachev initially made a very vivid impression on Margaret Thatcher, for example, because he was younger, because he could speak in whole sentences, because he seemed open to talking with Western leaders in a way that Mr. Brezhnev and the others could not. But he wasn't fully accepted as a reformer until he began to release prisoners and reduce and end censorship. That was a moral agenda that the dissidents helped to establish, and no one else. The dissidents may have been relatively few in number, but as Sakharov recognized during his exile in Gorky, what was important was the qualitative fact of breaking through the psychological barrier of silence. And this was, of course, fundamentally important for opening the Soviet Union to democratic reform. This was essentially Gorbachev's program. And though an argument can be fashioned that any thoughtful person who took the time and energy to examine Soviet society would have reached the same conclusion as Gorbachev did, the fact is that the dissidents attempted to articulate it out loud at a time when the regime could only respond with arrests and other reprisals. Sakharov never lost his moral compass or succumbed to the naive wishful belief that Gorbachev's initiatives meant that the Soviet Union was now fundamentally a different country, that its misery was over, that a prosperous democracy would emerge out of the decayed garden of Russian despotism. Gorbachev's unexpected and startling reforms may have lulled Western leaders into complacency over the prospects for democracy in the Soviet Union. Sakharov, for one, never entertained such illusions. Regrettably, several advisors to Gorbachev and other government officials exhibited ugly condescension toward human rights activists of the Brezhnev era, an attitude that reflected a certain self-important arrogance. They were in charge. The levers of power were in their hands. For them, the sacrifice of so many dissidents was a mere footnote in the country's history. The human rights movement provided a consistent and reliable means for the West to see and understand the reality of Soviet life. No other manifestation of open dissent would have been possible without the example set by human rights activists. The dissidents created the first independent channels to the West, the phenomenon of political samizdat, the example of courage in the struggle against fear. They proved that one could challenge the regime and survive, that truth provided its own strength, that law was worth defending. Their setbacks did not mark the triumph of a heartless, arrogant regime over an oppressed, intimidated people, but rather a courageous struggle, however quixotic or doomed to failure, between two Russias, the Russia of violence and deceit, and the Russia of justice and humanity, a struggle that continues. Thank you.
Okay. First, it's appropriate to thank to the organizers of this important and great conference, and I'm really honored to be made part of it. What I think I would like to do here is to bring slightly different perspective to the general debate. I'm Czech, so I'm coming from a perspective, let's say, of small or maximum medium-sized Central European nation in the heart of Europe. And obviously for us, the relationship and maybe difference between international and domestic perspective in that respect is extremely important. Obviously, we might have a tendency to excuse ourselves, excuse our mistake by pointing to, I would say, unfortunate international environment in which we have been historically operating. But at the same time, it is true that the relationship between domestic and international is a key thing. I think it was Professor Charles Getty who, in the early 1990s, made a difference between what he called satellization and Sovietization, which means turning you into a satellite of a certain system or being internally transformed. By the way, next year, this is a first from the whole number of anniversaries we'll be remembering. For us Czechs, next year with 8 means a lot. 1918, the state was created. 1938, one very important international event, Munich Treason, Munich Conference with appeasement. Czechs still believe, should we blame all others, not ourselves, for that situation. 1948 and 1968, two Cold War events that had a big impact on us, and the end of the century, 1989. By the way, I was a little bit confused that I haven't heard yet here at this conference anything on the relationship between October Revolution and the First World War. Because it seems to me that this relationship is really genuine and extremely important. For our national mythology, you know, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk wrote a book called World Revolution that justified the creation of Czechoslovakia. I would recommend to you to read something else, to read Elie Halevi, great French Jewish historian who wrote a book, The Age of Tyrannies, and pronounced in 1929 a great lecture at the University of Oxford in England with the title The World Crisis 1914-1918, where the war and revolution are greatly put together. I think that this is a very important text for our conversation. But let me to be aware of the fact that I have 10 minutes for my presentation. So I would like to limit myself on a very short period from the long history that I just laid out here, the 20th century. The period of history of Czechoslovakia, I myself was part of, which means I will focus on Charter 77 and on the 1970s and 1980s. Obviously, having said that, I have to warn you, and I'm just writing on a piece in which I'm trying to describe or articulate all these experiences. But obviously, it's a strange feeling to be a guide in a museum in which I'm one of the objects on the display. This is a little tricky thing to be someone who has experienced a certain period and now trying to put it into broader context. But anyway, I think that during my lifetime, I was born 1950, what I experienced, and this experience was greatly articulated by Václav Havel in one of his essays, we experience two different, very different varieties of totalitarian regime, of totalitarianism. The 50s, Stalinism, with all what it meant, so vividly described here. And then the normalization regime that came into existence in early 1970s with all what it meant. I think that this contrast already has been mentioned here too, when someone said that today's totalitarian leaders don't suffer any ideological deformations. They don't have ideology, they have just will to power. They want to keep themselves in power and enrich themselves and their families as much as they can. In 1970s, after Prague Spring, we can endlessly debate whether socialism could be reformed or at least endowed with human face, as the slogan in these days went. But in the early 1970s, Czechoslovak society lost all hopes and was driven by, saying the Polish colleague, captive mind, people who simply resigned, and maybe few of them decided to leave the country because it was not there were not good promises for free-minded people there. Those who didn't leave were looking for alternatives. And certainly it was interesting enough in the same time when in Geneva and also in Helsinki, the preparatory talks were taking place for the conference that culminated with the signature of Final Act in summer of 1975. In the same year, 1975, Václav Havel wrote a letter to dear Dr. Husák, to Secretary General of Communist Party, who very shortly became the president of the country and went to Helsinki to sign this agreement. And in this letter, Havel, in his sober but very precise way, described the state of society as he saw it in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s. Strange social contract concluded between the government and population. Government was saying, if you don't interfere into our matters, you can be okay. And even society full of people, they were not starving, relatively well-fed, so you couldn't see anything wrong. So Dr. Husák would have felt that his consolidation process worked. And Václav Havel simply told him, no, Mr. Husák, it did not. What is happening under the surface is something much more serious, and you should be occupied with that. Because people cannot live forever or in a long-term perspective with this type of schizophrenic situation, saying something in public and believing in something else. And he told him, I warn you, look at that and do something about that. Obviously, Dr. Husák didn't do anything, and certain small segment of Czechoslovak society heard the message. And I think that the way for Charter 77 kind of started. Because if we want to look at this document or at this initiative 40 years later, we have 40th anniversary of that this year, what can be said about that? First of all, in comparison with Polish numbers, it was a very small thing. 224 people originally, and in the end, less than 2,000 in the next 13 years. Motivation, I think motivation, why people became dissidents, why people wanted to do that, was articulated by Czech philosopher who happened to be one of the first spokespersons, Jan Patočka, who was basically using kind of Socratic arguments that you really should take care first about some sort of personal integrity, he called it soul, something which is more important than anything else. Obviously, not everybody can be persuaded by this fact, but many people were. And Charter 77 came into existence and created a small public space, which was extremely interesting. There was a debate after Charter 77 started, how this space can eventually be defended. And here comes what already has been here, two things. On the one hand, international context. Charter 77 that came to existence with very non-political motivations. Patočka's concept of human rights has been formulated by him as follows. This is about the truth of which we are all in some sense aware. The idea of human rights is nothing other than the conviction that even states, even societies as a whole, are subject to the sovereignty of moral sentiment, that they recognize something unconditional that is higher than they are, something that is binding even on them, sacred, unavailable, and that is in their power to establish and maintain a rule of law. They seek to express this recognition. So this was a, we want to say, highly idealistic perspective, but as it has been said, human rights, third basket of the Helsinki Conference, became a strong factor in the next rounds of international communications. I am now, in this paper, I'm working on trying to describe step by step small changes that Charter 77 experienced in the 15 years of its existence. On November 3rd, this year we commemorated the 25th anniversary of the end of Charter 77 in 1992. And the movement is from non-political to more and more political, and this transformation was certainly driven by both, by the international events. If 1975 was a certain year of beginning of something important, Helsinki Process started. 1985 was maybe even more important. It was Gorbachev in power, Gorbachev, Reagan, really changing international environment. And all that was reflected both in our relationships internationally. Here I would certainly need to stress our international relationships with our Polish friends. And I agree fully that the election of Polish Pope, John Paul II, not only in Catholic Poland, but in more secularized Czechoslovakia, was seen as an extremely important message. So we saw this process going forward, but the fact is that in 1989, it was not Charter 77 who could be one of the factors or players of the change. Charter 77 had to die so that something new can be created. People who were connected with Charter 77 still played an important role in the process. Václav Havel, I think, is an embodiment of that. But Charter 77, as such, had to become a history. And now we have a question, but it may be at another conference, what is his legacy today? The last thing is, the last sentence of Charter 77 document is that we believe that Charter 77 will help to enable all citizens of Czechoslovakia to work and live as free human beings. Whatever role Charter 77 had in this context, it was made true, and in 1989 we became free, no matter what we are doing with our freedom afterwards. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up, and the reason not to be contrarian, because I want to see you, but I can't see my notes over here. So to be very pragmatic, first, I'd like to as well congratulate the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, not only on holding this forum, but also on the mission. The stated mission, which is to, quote, to educate this generation and future generations about the ideology, history, and legacy of communism. And also its stated vision, which is, quote, a world free from the false hope of communism, unquote. We must never forget the more than 100 million victims of communism. I'm devoting my comments specifically to what have been and what are the policy implications from the various anti-communist, pro-freedom movements and activism that has taken place. I'm going to put forward 8 specific policy actions that I see. I will confine it mostly around the time that I was a practitioner and what I took away from the period, particularly in which I was working at the National Security Council at the White House in the Reagan administration. And I'd start with the very broad premise that the United States does not only espouse the principles of freedom, but we act on it, we lead. What mattered? Number one, ideas, words mattered. The cause of freedom, the cause of liberty. You've heard references to Reagan's speeches. They were very inspirational, and they provided not only the kind of hope, the hope that you heard Mr. Sharansky speak of when he was in the Gulag and then later read snippets in Pravda, but also that the activists and the movements were not alone, that they were very much connected to the West, that we had not forgotten them, and that we would not stop highlighting their imprisonment and also the kind of brutal treatment that they had been subjected to until they were released, until they were free, and they were able to fulfill their lives as they wished. The Evil Empire speech has been referenced already a number of times this afternoon. March 8, 1983, President Reagan delivered that speech, and it was really significant. It truly was, I would say, when people look back at that period, one of his most powerful and memorable speeches because of the content, because of the clarity, because of the directness of what he said and how it was articulated. It certainly was a speech that had an impact. How did it relate to the movements? One of the things, and I have the benefit of saying this in front of Mr. Sharansky, I had heard when you came to the United States that you had mentioned that the words, for example, of President Reagan mattered because it did give hope. Again, you were not isolated, you were connected. You will be hearing from Peter Robinson, who wrote the speech, which was the Tear Down the Wall speech when Reagan delivered it at Brandenburg Gate. That was another. So ideas and words matter. Secondly, human rights is integral to our foreign policy. Here, there were many different mechanisms in which we were able to continuously, from administration to administration, whether it was Republican or Democrat, spotlight the human rights issues and the kinds of atrocities. The annual Human Rights Report, which ultimately got codified, and now is something that all countries look to, looking for documentation on the kinds of atrocities that have been committed then and even up to the present time. Although Moscow rejected a dialogue on human rights, there were countless times that the president would pass over a list of cases. It was at that level. Or the Secretary of State, or congressional delegations, or the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, or the ambassador in country. This mattered as well because it was documented, it was specific, it showed that these issues were integral to our foreign policy. Thirdly, was also the economic component and economic actions. This, I'm sure all of you are familiar with, the deployment and usage of sanctions and conditionality. Here, they definitely benefited these movements because in some cases, there were actual quid pro quos. I think the first example is one that is quite well known, which is the Jackson-Vanik Act of 1974, using trade preferential treatment and the lifting of trade barriers on certain goods in return for processing and ensuring the free flow of those Jews who wanted to immigrate from the Soviet Union and also from Central and Eastern Europe. Also, another example is at the time there was the imposition of martial law in Poland, 1981-83, during that period, and the attempt to crush that very movement, that dissident movement, the Solidarność, and where sanctions were imposed. You may recall they were imposed not only against the Polish government, the Jaruzelski government, but it was also imposed against then the Soviet Union, against Moscow at that time. Later, the trade preferential or the most favored nation trade status of Poland was suspended. And also Poland's application for membership in the IMF was also vetoed. These were tangible, concrete foreign policy measures which demonstrated these issues mattered. This kind of activism had to be countered, not just by only what one said, but also by specific actions that would have consequences, in this case, economic consequences. Fourthly is a point that I think is somewhat interrelated to the human rights point, but it's a bit different. And that is that effective foreign policy combines elements of realism and idealism. Here, you would have, during the Reagan administration, talks on arms control, then with Moscow. You'd have this component of issues that would fit in the realism camp, if you will, that there were certain aspects of policy that had to be conducted. But at the same time, this did not sidetrack the importance of the dialogue in the human rights sector. And as I just said to you, countless times, this issue was always raised by interlocutors who went to Moscow or when their officials came here, and whether they'd say, well, this is not on our agenda, and no, we're not discussing it. Nevertheless, the US side persevered. So it's that dual track of bringing together both approaches. Fifthly, multilateral diplomacy. We began when Mr. Sharansky talked about the origins of the Helsinki Commission and the whole process of what it stood for, where it was, and where it ultimately how it ultimately evolved. This was a platform to spotlight the activists, and again, the kinds of atrocities that were taking place. That kind of international, multinational platform really mattered. The impact of a chorus of nations and also institutions could make a difference. And we even see it now, not only the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe, its 3 baskets, but right up to the present time, now as the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, and the work that it plays, particularly in terms of tracking elections, going into or trying to get into Crimea, for example, to track what is happening there. 6 are presidential statements and also congressional resolutions which mark commemorative occasions or they memorialize important historic dates. These kinds of things mattered greatly. 2 examples, and then let me tell you why. 2 examples, of course, is Human Rights Day, every December 10. If one forgets that Human Rights Day and no reference by an administration, it matters greatly. Also, the issue of the Captive Nations Week, which will also be discussed here. Starting with President Eisenhower, every president right up and through the present has issued a Captive Nations Week resolution and marking this very issue of what we're discussing today, that captive minds, the impact of ideology, and the fact that here you have this inability of those to be able to live freely. So right up to the present time, if you can imagine, from 1959 to the present, Public Law 8690 has been respected. Why does it matter? It keeps the issue of human rights and freedom in the forefront. It underscores also how these issues are integral to our foreign policy. It matters to us, not only as a nation, but what we're about, domestically and also abroad. It also buoys and motivates dissident movements because of our strong and consistent voice. And this is one example of where there's been consistency from 1959 to the present. The 2 last assistance programs to opposition activists mattered. For example, when Solidarność was born, institutions such as CARE and the Catholic Relief Service received funding from the US government and aid and assistance at a very crucial time during martial law. You're familiar with the National Endowment for Democracy, which President Reagan launched and spoke to and launched during his visit to London and before Westminster in 1982 when he announced its creation. This was absolutely crucial. What kinds of programs would they fund? One that I remember very specifically, there was a dissident group then in the Soviet Union that, by the way, simply wanted to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights translated into Russian so it could be widely disseminated and people would know their rights. Finally, I'll conclude with the fact that when you have consistent policy declarations which are maintained through successive administrations, it matters. former President Landsbergis of Lithuania here, I have to mention one that really is in the forefront of my mind, and that is the non-recognition policy of the forced incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. It's an absolute policy position that showed that we were consistent, that consistency and that declaration of where we stood paid off. It paid off. You know, that was from 1940 up to 1991. And it started with Sumner Welles, with the Welles Declaration right up to the present time. So in sum, what we did, I think, really mattered, and we were not silent in word or in deed. Thank you.